The first thing about desert terror films is they grow out of the environment. Like the story is bound up in the environment. Like it couldn't take place anywhere else. You couldn't take that script and put it in another location. It wouldn't work.
From the Autry Museum, located on Tongva Homelands in Los Angeles, California, join us in asking, what is a Western? Welcome. Our guest today is Brad Sykes. Brad is the award-winning screenwriter and director of more than 20 films, and he's the author of Terror in the Desert, Dark Cinema of the American Southwest. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Your book identifies a genre that hadn't really been identified before in terms of dark Southwestern terror or dark desert films. And I know there's a lot of subgenres. Can you describe how it began to occur to you that this was, in fact, an unidentified genre?
Well, I like to say that I've sort of been writing this book in my head for around 25 years or so. There were two movies I saw in the 80s when I was, watching movies on cable and renting movies on VHS that made a big impression on me. There were two movies that I didn't identify them as desert terror maybe necessarily, but they had a huge impact. And the first film of those was The Hitcher, which was a 1986 road thriller with Rutger Hauer and Tommy Howell that is basically about a guy driving cross country who makes the mistake of picking up this malevolent hitchhiker who makes his life absolute hell and frames him for murders and all kinds of awful stuff. That movie, I saw that on cable and it just blew me away, not necessarily because it was violent and intense, although it was those two things, but it was also just the environment, the desert environment that it took place in was just like, I'd never seen anything like that before in any movie, horror movies or otherwise. And so I kind of, there was something that happened there where I realized this is not like other suspense films. This is not like other thrillers. It's something about the location, the isolation and the yet beauty of the desert environment contrasted with that violence that just made it so unique. The other film I saw around the same time was The Hills Have Eyes, which is a 1970s sort of drive-in grindhouse kind of film about a family who gets stranded in the desert and attacked by this cannibal family who lives in the hills, lives in the rocks above the desert. And different type of film, much more low budget, definitely more raw, but it was the same idea where it's this desert setting that is like a character in the movie. As much as any of the characters, which are very strong characters in that film, it's the setting is just as important as anything else that's happening. So there was something with those two films, when I saw them, they made a huge impression on me. And then, over the years, I would just keep seeing films like this and be attracted to films like this, what I would call desert terror movies, that the location is such a big part of that. And it kind of separates them from other horror and thriller and suspense films. So it's been percolating for a long time. It had been percolating for a long time. And then I never thought about writing a book for some reason until around 5 years ago. I was watching a movie called Ghosts That Still Walk, which is a obscure Native American themed horror film from the 70s. And it was all this desert stuff going on, like the, desert scenes. And I was like, it wasn't even like the movie was that good. It's kind of a mediocre movie. But for some reason, while I was watching, I almost went to this state where I started thinking about other desert horror films. And I'm like, man, I've been watching movies like this. And I've even made a few movies like this since the 80s. And I'm like, this is a genre. It might have its own place, just like, say, woods-based slasher movies do, films of underwater horror, or, space horror, things like that. That's when I really started thinking about it, was after watching Ghosts That Still Walk. Started making a list, and it did occur to me that not only was this a genre, but it's a genre that goes back in time, even to the silent movie era, and is still continuing today. So it's very valid. It's not like it's just of a particular time and it's forgotten and it's dusty and whatever. It's actually something that's still going on now and has roots in the very early days of cinema.
Now, so for those viewers who aren't familiar with horror genres, but maybe are more familiar with other types of films about the West, what are the overlaps there between the West as a setting, as a sort of real place for movies, any old movie that's set in the West, or the West as a kind of fictional frontier Western genre place? Where are the overlaps between those and some of the movies that you've identified in your book?
The first thing about desert terror films is they grow out of the environment. Like the story is bound up in the environment. Like it couldn't take place anywhere else. You couldn't take that script and put it in another location. It wouldn't work. And that's what makes a movie special to me. And they play off of aspects of the desert in the Southwest that are already there. They just amplify that. Well, for one thing, you think about the extreme temperatures you have in the desert. You know, you think of the extreme heat during the day and the cold at night. That lends itself to like survival horror kind of stories. The type of wildlife you have in the desert, snakes and scorpions, all this deadly, you know, poisonous critters. Well, that lends itself also to these type of films, and sometimes can be taken in a very fanciful direction. These atomic sci-fi movies of the 50s, where you had giant ants or giant scorpions and stuff, but they're all based in the desert. They all grow out of what's already there. And then, you know, in a broader sense, there's just the feeling of isolation that anyone would get if they're driving cross country or even driving from one state to another. There's that beauty and that sense of getting away from society and that escape from civilization. But then there's the flip side of that, which is, what if you have a breakdown? What if you're stranded? There's all kinds of bad things that can happen there. And then, in even more general sense, there's the idea of who chooses to live in the desert. And I mean, like very, you know, in the really isolated communities, what kind of people live there? You're going to get some outsider kind of characters there that, once again, you've taken a darker direction. It could turn into something really nightmarish. So really, it's all these movies, they play off of aspects of the desert in the Southwest, that are environments that are already there. I should mention ghost towns too, because we're talking about the Western past and Native American past. In some cases, obviously not some very, you know, not so great things there, or at least very violent things, a history of violence, essentially. And that's another thing that you can touch on, once again, in a, you know, more realistic sense, or in a more fantasy sense with, you know, ghost stories and, you know, kind of this type of stuff, supernatural horror that could grow out of the West. So those are all these movies have in common, whatever kind of subgenres you put them in, the desert terror films, they all play off of the environment. The environment is like a character in the movie as much as any of the actual characters in the story or anything. So it's what makes them special to me, what makes them deserving of their own category.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I mean, that's what we think of for all movies about the West, really, in some way, is that the environment is a character.
Oh, yeah.
It's just here that it's kind of turned up a few notches, or
Oh, yeah,
or
absolutely. The Hitcher, without a doubt, is that kind of the last scene in the movie is like a gunfight at the OK Corral. You know, it's like one guy against another, high noon. You know, literally. I mean, it's the same concept. So a lot of these films, almost intentionally or not, they draw from Western iconography and, you know, archetypes and situations and visuals and everything. So you can find Western past in just about any of these films.
Right.
Some more obviously than others, but you can find it.
I loved your book. You kind of come up with a lot of different kind of subcategories and subcategories. I encourage everyone to read it, to find out all of them. We're not going to be able to go through everything, but I thought we would identify a couple of those and just go into them in a little more depth to give a bit of a background or a little more deep dive for some of our viewers. And one of them you kind of already mentioned, which is that kind of Hitcher or road movie or breakdown movie. Sort of how do you, what are some of the examples? How does that kind of change in different movies?
Yeah, well, that was one of the first things when I first started like putting the book together and kind of dividing all these, you know, because I have around 200 movies in the book. I realized there were really three distinct type of road-oriented desert terror subgenres. And when I called these in the book, where I just grouped them under Highways to Hell, referencing, you know, sort of the AC/DC song. And then there's also a movie called Highway to Hell, which is sort of a fantasy horror film that's also, you know, in the desert. There are three sort of subgenres there. The first is what I call Hitcher killer movies, which you mentioned, the Hitcher. That's definitely a great example of that type of film, which is, you know, the essential concept is regular folks are on the road and they pick up the hitchhiker, maybe male or female, who turns their life upside down. One of the great examples of that is actually an older film from the 50s called The Hitchhiker, which is a film noir, 3 characters, kind of a true crime inspired film where you got 2 buddies going, they're in California going to Mexico, and they pick up a guy who turns out to be a killer. That's a great film, and that was kind of one of the first films that had that idea of, you don't know who you're picking up, like, ruin your life or you end your life. Moving forward in time, The Hitcher, I mentioned earlier, that's just a incredible example. Once again, basically 2 characters. And that's something that a lot of desert terror films have, whatever type of movie they are. They tend to be minimalist. The best ones especially tend to be minimalist. They don't have a lot of characters. You don't have these big narratives that go on for like weeks or months or years. They usually take place in a couple of days or maybe even 24 hours. They tend to be very compressed. The Hitcher, really 2 characters, guy driving cross country, picks somebody up, and all hell breaks loose. The flip side of that, which is a whole other subgenre, is what I call death driver movies, where it's the opposite of the Hitcher killer. This one is the bad guy, the killer or whatever, is driving the car. They're behind the wheel. So they're menacing people usually in these, in this southwestern locations where there's nowhere to run. That's one of the things about the desert. You can't hide anywhere. Mm-hmm. It's not like the woods, the city or whatever, an urban area. There's nowhere to hide. There's a movie called Death Valley that came out in '82, which is set in, big surprise, Death Valley. Although the thing is, there are movies called Death Valley that were not shot in Death Valley. So it does matter. This one's actually, guys, if you've ever seen A Christmas Story, the little kid from A Christmas Story, Peter Billingsley, he's like one of the main characters. He's like a little boy on a trip in Death Valley with his mom and her mom's boyfriend. So there's some kind of family friction going on, and they stumble onto a serial killer who's in the area. So there's basically the premise, and it just makes great use of the old west town in the area. There's all kinds of like landmarks. If you know Death Valley, there's all kinds of cool landmarks that show up. Scotty's Castle, there's all kinds of cool things that show up in this movie. It's just a good little suspense movie and it's kind of interesting having a child as one of the main characters. It just adds an extra element of kind of peril to the thing, and it's just unique, I think. And then the third group is Murder Machines, which is the vehicle itself is the killer. You don't really see, in these movies, you don't see the driver. There might not even be a driver. Sometimes there's like a supernatural element in it where it's literally a possessed vehicle going around killing people. The best example of that, the first and still best, is a movie called Duel, which we showed at the Autry earlier this year, actually in January, and Steven Spielberg directed. Really a one character piece. Talk about minimalism. Really one character, one actor, Dennis Weaver, just a guy trying to drive up the freeway in California, up 5 or something up north, menaced by this tanker truck that just won't leave him alone. And you never see the driver. And it's got, once again, that idea of, civilized man having to deal with nature, the desert, kind of this rougher, going back in time to this sort of survivalist kind of instincts. Tremendous. Just an amazing movie. Still one of Spielberg's best movies, in my opinion. And then after that, every film that's really in that subgenre has really, I think, drawn from Duel. Like there's a movie called The Car that came out in the 70s after Duel that's literally a possessed satanic car that's running people off the road in a small town. So those are the 3 subgenres of the road-based desert terror films.
There's a lot there. But to take it in a
few of them, those are some of the best.
I know, and you have probably 10 times that many in the book. And then to take it in a wholly different direction, another sort of strain of films that you identified kind of have to do with Native American stories. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, how the presence of Native people, which is much more visible to a lot of people in the American West, how that plays out within terror and horror movies.
Yeah, that's something that the Native American horror, films, or the desert terror films that are in that, I sort of grouped in my book, I grouped them under the category of weird Westerns, because they, more than other desert terror movies, they play off of or draw from the myths of the West, the myths of the Old West. And in some cases in good ways, some in a bad way, But what's interesting about those movies is there were films with Native Americans in them in the genre, going back to the serials, going back to like John Wayne early films and things like that, kind of mixing horror and action. But those films are mostly dealing with like stereotypes, and they didn't really add anything. It wasn't until 1970s that the Native American themes started to come up in more of a serious way in these films. I think one of the first major ones was a movie called Nightwing that Columbia Pictures put out in the late 70s. And that was sort of in the wake of Jaws. Everyone was trying to cash into a Revenge of Nature movie and trying to find an animal to use. And this was sort of a Jaws with wings, because Nightwing is using bats. There's a whole lot more to that movie than just bats attacking people. There's a real grounding in like Native American culture, in the politics of that, the politics of reservations, of people being taken off their land, certain people taking sides even within the community. You've got like Native American characters who sort of side with corporate interests, and you've got others that are more on the traditional side. You've got people that are caught in the middle. It's almost a lot for a movie like this to take on, but it makes it more interesting than just being a straightforward creature movie. So that was one of the first ones, I think, first studio examples of that, to really like take that kind of content seriously. In the 90s, these movies got more sophisticated. The Native American themes were taken more seriously, and it wasn't going into the sort of supernatural creature realm as much as it was dealing with real situations that went on back then or are going on now. There's a movie called Silent Tongue that I love, that I tell people about all the time, that Sam Shepard wrote and directed. It was one of the only films he directed. It's a period piece. It's like a ghost story mixed with kind of like a Old West travelogue. They're characters that are in different parts, different places. They're sort of interconnected, but what unifies everything is this ghost story and the sort of the haunted past of some of the white characters for things that they did, crimes that they perpetrated, basically. So it's a really interesting mix of like horror genre and drama and kind of like historical piece. Another one that I love to talk about or tell people about is The Brave, which is a Johnny Depp film. He actually directed the movie. It's the only movie he ever directed that he stars in. And in that movie, that's a contemporary piece. And basically the concept in that is Johnny Depp is a Native American man living with his family essentially in a dump. There's like a whole community who lives outside of this dump. He is destitute and needs to make money somehow. And what he ends up doing is falling in with this character who is played by Marlon Brando, who makes snuff films. Essentially, he sells his life. He sells himself to Brando to participate in a snuff film, to be killed, and the money is going to be paid out to his family. It's a real, like, kind of bittersweet, dark piece because, he gets some of the money up front, so he's kind of trying to treat them to all kinds of things, and they don't know what's going to happen to the father. It's a really interesting movie that really addresses things directly as opposed to through metaphors. It's a little more direct. It's an obscure film, but it's worth looking for. So those are some of there are others, obviously, but
Right.
The 90s was just like with a lot of American cinema. The 70s was a turning point, in terms of all genres. And the 90s was also, I think, a big time for indie themes and ideas to be addressed in a more serious way, more on a bigger level, let's say. So you have major actors and major, studios behind these films. And so you end up with some pretty interesting movies. And they're still making films like this. And they're still using Old West motifs, and Native American themes are still coming up in the movies. And even now, they're still being addressed, maybe even more so now. People are becoming more aware of this kind of stuff and finding ways to treat it more seriously outside of a genre context.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research process? As you said, some of these are really obscure films. How did you find them? How did you put your hands on things, or how hard was it to find certain things?
When I first made my list out, I probably had around 100 titles. And then as I worked my way through the book, I probably ended up with around 200. So this was like a process of discovery for me. It wasn't like I'd seen all these movies, I owned all of them, and I was just going down a list, checking them off. I was discovering as I was going. And sometimes you'd find a movie that you'd find out about a movie and go, well, how am I going to see that? For example, there were a lot of, especially the 70s through the 90s, there were a lot of made-for-TV movies that are really great film, that are desert terror films. Like Duel is an obvious example. Duel started as a TV movie before it later got theatrical release. And those films, they're either not on video at all, or they're maybe, you luck out and somebody put them on YouTube, or, they're on VHS. So I had to track down a lot of those. So that was the thing. I had to, sometimes just find things on YouTube, Sometimes it was about scouring eBay, other friends of mine who are collectors and stuff like that. You'd have to get foreign sources. But I like that aspect of it. Like, I don't think I would have wanted to have written this book if it was like easy to find all these movies. That would be really uninteresting to me, actually. Like, I wanted to give people something with this book. I wanted them to like find out about a bunch of movies through this, not just read about a bunch of horror films that they've seen covered to death in other people's books. I didn't feel like there was any point to that. So it was fun for me to excavate all these movies. And I'm still finding them. I mean, I still hear things here and there, find out, oh, darn it, I should have got, oh, well, maybe volume 2. And I had to stop after a while too, because it was just, there was a point where it was like, I could keep doing this for probably for the rest of my life. I mean, you could keep finding movies and adding them in. I even added a few titles in. I remember right before the book was published, I contacted the publisher and I said, I know we've done the layout and everything, but I just found like 3 more movies. We did incorporate those reviews in there. But there was a point where it was like, okay, we had to stop.
Time to turn it down and turn it off now. Yeah.
And I wanted it to be published too sometime in my lifetime as well. So, But
it's safe to say you have a working VCR at your house as well, as well as a DVD.
More than one. I actually have 3.
Okay.
Because I used for different things, like certain machines work better for certain. It's weird. It's a weird thing you find out. But yeah, I've still got, and a lot of the movies, I've still got a lot of those tapes here because they were films that just weren't on DVD. They've never been put on. They're not streaming either. For example, we showed a movie at the Autry, I think it was last year, called Curse of the Undead. It was a Universal Western vampire film. It was the first vampire Western. And you think Universal horror, you think, oh, Dracula, Frankenstein, those movies are really easy to find, right? Well, those movies are, but Curse of the Undead, which was made in 1959 and was at the end of the cycle, like end of the Universal horror cycle, was only on VHS. So it was actually hard to get materials. Like when we screened it, it was hard to get materials. But now that movie is coming out on Blu-ray. Like literally next month, it's coming out on Blu-ray. That's been a nice kind of like silver lining on this. Some of these films is that since the book was published, some of these obscure movies, and they're very good movies, deserving movies, they're coming out finally on digital formats. So that's good news.
Yes, definitely. Well, that is all something to look forward to, and we will include some of your recommendations in this on the page with this interview. So we're really excited to work our way through a somewhat shorter list of the things that you recommend.
Yeah, I try to find a good middle ground between like established classics that are easily found and things that you might not have seen.
Well, thank you, Brad, for coming on the show, and we really look forward to working our way through in a sort of Western scare-a-thon your list of recommendations. So thank you once again for coming on.
No, you're very welcome. It's been fun, as always.
All right, thank you. The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.